She dumped soup in my lap and said, "Ghosts shouldn't take seats. You're dead weight in this family." My granddaughter laughed. I stood up, made one call. By morning, their bank accounts were frozen. Rent was due. No one helped. But let me tell you how we really got here, because that moment was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for 3 years. I should have known something was off the moment I walked into my son David's house that evening. Usually, Sarah would come running to the door when she heard my car in the driveway. At 16, she was supposedly too cool for grandma hugs, but she still lit up when I brought her the chocolate chip cookies I made every Sunday. This time, she barely looked up from her phone when I entered. "Hi, Grandma Margaret," she mumbled, not moving from the couch where she was sprawled with her legs across the cushions I'd helped pick out 2 years ago when David and Jessica had redecorated. Jessica emerged from the kitchen wearing that smile she reserved for special occasions. You know the one. Perfectly practiced, reaching her lips but never quite making it to her eyes. She was dressed in one of those flowing designer blouses that probably cost more than most people make in a week.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Her blonde hair swept back in an effortless style that I knew took her 40 minutes to achieve. "Margaret, you made it," she said, though her tone suggested she'd been hoping otherwise. "I was just telling Sarah how excited we were to have you join us for her birthday dinner." I clutched the small wrapped present in my hands a little tighter. Inside was a vintage silver bracelet I'd found at an estate sale, something Sarah had admired in an old photograph of her great-grandmother. I'd spent weeks tracking down something similar because I remembered how her eyes had lingered on that picture. "Of course I wouldn't miss Sarah's sweet 16, I replied, trying to keep my voice warm despite the chill I felt settling over the room. That's when I noticed them, the other guests. 4 couples I'd never seen before, all impeccably dressed, sitting in my son's living room, holding wine glasses and speaking in those hushed, important tones that people use when they want everyone to know their conversation matters more than yours. "Oh," Jessica said, following my gaze. "I hope you don't mind. We invited a few friends to make it more of a celebration. You know how teenagers are. They want everything to be special." I looked at Sarah, who was still staring at her phone, clearly mortified by the entire situation. This didn't feel like something she'd requested. This felt like something that had been decided for her. The dining room table was set for 10, and I could see immediately where I'd been placed. The far end, squeezed between an empty chair and a man who was already deep in conversation with the woman across from him about their recent vacation to the Hamptons. I was positioned where I could be easily forgotten, where my presence wouldn't interfere with the real party happening at the other end of the table. David appeared from the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine. His face flushed from what I suspected was not just the heat from cooking. "Mom, great, you're here." He kissed my cheek quickly, but there was something distracted about it, like he was going through the motions. "Jessica's made this incredible dinner. You're going to love it." I wanted to ask him when he'd stopped really seeing me, when I'd become someone to be managed rather than celebrated. But this was Sarah's night, so I smiled and took my assigned seat at the furthest possible point from the birthday girl. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Stock portfolios, private school decisions, summer house rentals in Martha's Vineyard. I had nothing to contribute to these topics, or rather, nothing they would want to hear from someone they clearly saw as David's elderly mother, who needed to be included out of obligation. I tried to engage with Sarah, asking about her classes, her friends, her plans for college, but every time I spoke, Jessica would swoop in with some comment that redirected the conversation back to her guests, back to topics that excluded me entirely. "Margaret, you wouldn't understand this, but we're discussing the new SAT prep programs," she'd say. Or, "This is probably boring for you, but we're talking about college admission strategies." Each dismissal was delivered with that same practiced smile, making it impossible to call out without seeming oversensitive. Jessica was an expert at this kind of subtle cruelty, the death by 1,000 small cuts that left you questioning whether you were imagining the hostility. But I wasn't imagining anything. I could see exactly what was happening, just like I'd been seeing it for the past 3 years, ever since Jessica had decided that having David's mother around cramped her style. The soup course arrived, and I should have known. Jessica made a big show of serving everyone personally, making sure each guest felt special and attended to. When she got to me, she was telling some animated story about Sarah's latest academic achievement, gesturing with the ladle as she spoke. That's when it happened. The accident. Hot butternut squash soup splashed across my lap, soaking through the navy dress I'd worn specifically because David had once said it was his favorite. The liquid was scalding, and I gasped as it burned through the fabric to my skin. "Oh my goodness," Jessica exclaimed, but she made no move to help me. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. How clumsy of me." The other guests looked on with that mixture of pity and discomfort that people get when they witness someone else's humiliation. But it was what Jessica said next that stopped my heart. "Ghosts shouldn't take seats," she said, just loud enough for everyone to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. "You're dead weight in this family." The table went silent. Even the man who'd been monopolizing conversation about his investment portfolio stopped mid-sentence. Everyone was staring at me, waiting to see how I would respond to being called dead weight by my own daughter-in-law in front of a room full of strangers. But it was Sarah's reaction that cut deepest. My granddaughter, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep and taught to bake cookies and helped with homework, looked at me and laughed. Not the uncomfortable laugh of someone trying to diffuse tension, but genuine amusement, as if Jessica had said something genuinely funny. That's when I knew. This wasn't just Jessica's cruelty. This was a coordinated effort, a planned humiliation designed to put me in my place once and for all. Sarah had been coached, prepared for this moment when her grandmother would finally be revealed as the burden everyone pretended she wasn't. I stood up slowly, soup dripping from my dress onto Jessica's pristine hardwood floors. My hands were shaking, but not from embarrassment, from something much more dangerous. For 3 years, I'd watched Jessica systematically poison my relationship with my son and granddaughter. I'd endured the subtle insults, the excluded invitations, the gradual erosion of my place in their lives. I'd told myself it was temporary, that family love would eventually win out over Jessica's manipulations. But tonight, looking at these strangers who'd been brought in to witness my humiliation, seeing my granddaughter laugh at my pain, watching my son say nothing in my defense, I finally understood the truth. I wasn't fighting for my place in this family anymore. I was fighting for my dignity. And unlike Jessica, I didn't fight with cruel words or social manipulation. I fought with power she couldn't even imagine. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The room was still silent, everyone waiting to see what the pathetic old woman would do next. I dialed a number I knew by heart and waited for the answer. "It's Margaret," I said quietly. "Execute Plan B." I hung up and looked around the table one more time. At Jessica, who was trying to maintain her innocent expression. At David, who was staring at his plate like a coward. At Sarah, who was finally looking uncomfortable as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. "Thank you for a lovely evening," I said, my voice steady despite everything. "I hope you all remember it." I walked out of that house with as much dignity as I could muster, leaving behind the soup-stained chair and the family that had chosen to humiliate rather than love me. Behind me, I could hear Jessica trying to restart the conversation, making jokes about how old people can be so dramatic. But there was an edge to her voice now, a uncertainty that hadn't been there before. She should have been uncertain, because in 30 seconds I'd just changed everything, and she had no idea what was coming. As I drove home through the quiet streets, my dress still damp with soup, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not sadness, not defeat, but a cold, clear sense of purpose. Jessica wanted to play games. She'd spent 3 years thinking she was so clever, so strategic in her campaign to erase me from my own family's life. Tomorrow, she was going to learn that some games have rules she never knew existed, and some players have been holding cards she never even knew were in the deck. The phone call I'd made was just the beginning. I spent that entire night replaying every moment of the past 3 years, seeing Jessica's campaign against me with crystal clarity for the first time. Sitting in my small kitchen at 2 a.m., still wearing the soup-stained dress because I couldn't bring myself to take it off yet, I finally understood how masterfully I'd been played. It had started so subtly. Little comments about how I looked tired, suggestions that maybe I shouldn't drive at night anymore, gentle hints that perhaps I was becoming forgetful. Jessica had been building a narrative about my decline that everyone else had started to believe, including me. The Christmas when she'd rearranged the entire gift exchange so that I gave Sarah a duplicate of something Jessica had already bought, making me look confused and out of touch. The birthday party where she'd told me the wrong time, ensuring I'd arrive after all the photos were taken and the celebration was winding down. The gradual elimination of my opinions from family decisions, always with the excuse that they didn't want to burden me with choices. Each incident was small enough to explain away, but together they painted a picture of a woman who was no longer quite capable of being a full participant in family life. Jessica had been gaslighting me so gradually that I'd started to doubt my own perceptions. But tonight had been different. Tonight, she'd overplayed her hand. My phone rang at exactly 7 a.m., jerking me out of the light sleep I'd finally fallen into on my living room couch. Jessica's name flashed on the screen, and I let it ring 4 times before answering. Margaret? Her voice was different now, stripped of its usual condescending sweetness. We need to talk. Good morning. Jessica, I said calmly, setting down my coffee cup. How did you sleep? Don't play games with me, she snapped, and I could hear David's voice in the background, agitated and urgent. What did you do? I'm not sure what you mean. The bank called this morning. They're saying there's some kind of issue with our accounts, some complication with guarantees that need to be addressed immediately. They mentioned your name. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring both the warmth and the panic I could hear building in Jessica's voice. How strange. What kind of complications? They're being vague, but they want to meet with David today. They mentioned something about loan conditions that might not have been met. Her voice cracked slightly. Margaret, if you did something, if you're trying to hurt us because of last night, Jessica, I interrupted gently, I would never hurt my family. That's not who I am. The silence that followed was loaded with everything she couldn't say. That she knew exactly who she was and what she'd been doing to me, that she understood on some level that consequences were finally catching up to her actions. The rent's due today, she said finally, and I could hear the desperation she was trying to hide. If there's some kind of freeze on our accounts, I'm sure everything will work out, I said. These banking matters usually do, don't they? After I hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and allowed myself the first genuine smile I'd had in months. Jessica had no idea what was coming because she'd never bothered to really know who I was. To her, I was just David's aging mother, a relic from his past that needed to be managed and eventually discarded. She had no clue that Margaret Patterson had built a successful consulting firm from nothing in the 1980s, when women in business were still fighting for every scrap of respect. She didn't know that I'd sold that firm for 8 figures in 2019, choosing to live quietly on the interest rather than flash my wealth around like some kind of trophy. Most importantly, she had no idea that 6 months ago, when David had confessed to me in a moment of vulnerability that he and Jessica were drowning in credit card debt and facing foreclosure on their house, I hadn't just helped them out of kindness. I'd helped them strategically. My lawyer, Harrison Webb, had crafted the loan documents beautifully. On the surface, they looked like a simple family assistance package. I'd paid off their debts, covered their mortgage, and established a line of credit that kept them comfortable. David had been so grateful, so relieved, that he'd signed everything without reading the fine print. But buried in those documents, in language that would hold up in any court, were specific conditions. Behavioral conditions that I'd insisted upon, knowing Jessica's character better than she knew it herself. The loans were contingent upon maintaining respectful family relationships and honoring the dignity of all family members. Vague enough to avoid seeming controlling, specific enough to be legally enforceable. If I could demonstrate that these conditions had been violated, the entire assistance package could be called in immediately. Last night's performance, witnessed by 8 people, had been a violation so clear that even Jessica's charm couldn't explain it away. The documentation I'd been quietly gathering for months would tell the story perfectly. The text messages where she'd mocked me to her friends. The times she'd deliberately excluded me from family events while telling David I was too tired to attend. The gradual campaign of disrespect that she'd thought was too subtle for anyone to notice. My phone rang again. David this time. Mom, what's happening? His voice was strained. frightened. Jessica said you did something to our accounts? Hello, sweetheart. I haven't done anything to your accounts. But the bank? The bank is simply reviewing the terms of the assistance I provided 6 months ago. It's a routine check to ensure all conditions are being met. There was a long pause. What conditions? I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar sadness wash over me. My own son had been so desperate for financial relief that he'd signed documents without reading them, so trusting of his mother that he'd never imagined I might protect myself from his wife's cruelty. The conditions we discussed, David, about maintaining family harmony and treating all family members with respect. Mom. I don't understand. Ask Jessica, I said quietly. I think she understands perfectly. The silence stretched between us, and I could almost hear him processing what I wasn't saying directly, that his wife had crossed a line, that her behavior had consequences, that his mother wasn't quite as helpless as everyone had been pretending. About last night, he started, and I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, urgent and demanding. What about last night? Jessica said there was an accident with the soup, and maybe you misunderstood. David, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Do you remember what she said to me? Another pause. Longer this time. She said she was apologizing for spilling the soup, so he was going to lie for her. Even now, even knowing that his financial stability hung in the balance, he was going to pretend that calling his mother dead weight in front of strangers was just an accident. I see, I said. Well, I'm sure everything will work itself out. Mom, please, if we did something wrong, if Jessica said something she didn't mean, I need to go, David. I have a meeting with Harrison Webb in an hour. Who's Harrison Webb? My lawyer. I hung up before he could respond, and immediately my phone started buzzing with text messages. Jessica, David, even Sarah, all suddenly very interested in talking to the grandmother they'd dismissed as dead weight just 12 hours earlier. I turned the phone off and went to get dressed for my meeting. Harrison had been expecting this call for months. We'd planned for every contingency, documented every slight, prepared for the moment when Jessica's mask would finally slip completely. Tonight had been that moment, and now the real education was about to begin, because Jessica had made one crucial mistake in her campaign against me. She'd assumed that because I was older, because I lived quietly, because I didn't flaunt my success, that I was powerless. She was about to learn the difference between choosing to be invisible and actually being helpless. The phone calls and text messages would continue all day, growing more desperate as the reality of their situation became clear. But I wouldn't be answering them. I'd spent 3 years being available whenever they needed something from me, being grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. Now, they could wait for mine. Harrison Webb's office overlooked downtown from the 32nd floor, all glass and steel and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about success. I'd been his client for over a decade, and he was one of the few people who knew the full extent of what I'd built and what I was capable of. Margaret, he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk as his assistant showed me in. I take it last night went exactly as we expected? I settled into the leather chair across from him, placing my purse carefully on the side table. Worse, actually. I underestimated Jessica's willingness to humiliate me publicly. Harrison opened a thick file folder I recognized immediately. We'd been building this case for 6 months, ever since David's desperate phone call about their financial situation had given me the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Tell me exactly what happened, he said, his pen poised over a legal pad. I recounted the evening in precise detail, the deliberate seating arrangement, the dismissive comments throughout dinner, the accidental soup incident. Most importantly, Jessica's exact words about ghosts and dead weight, spoken in front of 8 witnesses. Harrison nodded as he took notes, and Sarah's reaction? That was the part that still hurt most. She laughed. Not uncomfortable laughter, genuine amusement. Coached, do you think? Absolutely. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was planned humiliation. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying the documents spread across his desk. Well, they've certainly violated the family harmony clauses. Multiple times by the sound of it. The question is, how far you want to take this. That was what I'd been wrestling with all morning. The loan documents Harrison had drafted gave me enormous leverage. I could call in the entire debt immediately, the credit card payments, The mortgage assistance, the line of credit. David and Jessica would lose their house, their cars, everything they'd become accustomed to. But David was still my son, despite his cowardice. And Sarah was still my granddaughter, despite her cruelty. I want them to understand consequences, I said finally. But I also want them to have a chance to make this right. Harrison smiled. It was the expression of someone who'd been planning for exactly this conversation. In that case, I suggest we implement Phase 2. Phase 2 had been my idea, developed during those long nights when I'd lain awake cataloging every slight, every dismissal, every moment when Jessica had made me feel invisible in my own family. It was more elegant than simple financial destruction, and potentially more effective. The 30-day provision? I asked. Exactly. We notify them that the family harmony clauses have been violated, but we give them 30 days to demonstrate genuine change in behavior. Specific, measurable changes that can't be faked or manipulated. I thought about the text messages still piling up on my turned-off phone. Jessica and David scrambling to understand what was happening, probably still believing this was some kind of misunderstanding they could smooth over with the right words. What kind of changes? Harrison consulted his notes. Public acknowledgement of the disrespect. An apology delivered in front of the same witnesses who saw the humiliation. Inclusion in all family decisions for the 30-day period. Most importantly, evidence that Sarah understands the gravity of her behavior and is willing to make amends. It was perfect. Jessica's pride would make a public apology nearly impossible for her, but without it, she'd lose everything she'd worked so hard to secure. And if she did manage to swallow her ego long enough to comply, I'd have 30 days to observe whether any real change was possible. There's something else, Harrison continued, his expression growing more serious. While we've been building this case, I had my investigators look into Jessica's background more thoroughly. A chill ran down my spine. What did you find? He slid a photograph across the desk. It showed Jessica at what looked like an upscale restaurant, laughing intimately with a man I didn't recognize. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 months ago. Her marriage to David isn't her first, Harrison said quietly. She was previously married to a businessman in Portland. Divorced him after 2 years, citing irreconcilable differences. But according to court records, there were allegations of financial impropriety. I stared at the photograph, seeing Jessica's expression of genuine joy. More happiness than I'd ever seen her show with David. What kind of impropriety? She apparently convinced him to take out several large loans using his business as collateral, claiming they were for renovations and investments. When the marriage ended, those debts remained his responsibility while she walked away with a substantial settlement. The pattern was becoming clear, and it made me sick to my stomach. She's done this before. It appears so. The Portland husband lost his business within a year of the divorce. Had to declare bankruptcy. I thought about David, my gentle son who'd always been too trusting for his own good. How long had Jessica been planning this? Had she targeted him specifically because of his kind nature? Or had she simply been opportunistic when she'd discovered his financial vulnerabilities? There's more, Harrison continued. The man in the photograph? He's married, very wealthy, lives in Seattle. The room seemed to spin slightly. Jessica wasn't just financially manipulative. She was actively planning her exit strategy from David while still securing her position in his life. How long has this been going on? Based on the investigation, at least 6 months, possibly longer. 6 months. Right around the time David had first confessed his financial troubles to me, Jessica had been working multiple angles, securing my financial assistance to prop up their lifestyle, while simultaneously cultivating her next target. Does David know? I doubt it. Your son seems genuinely devoted to her, despite everything. I felt a surge of protective anger, unlike anything I'd experienced. Jessica hadn't just been cruel to me, she'd been systematically destroying my son's life while pretending to love him. David's increasing anxiety over the past year, his growing isolation from his old friends, his constant apologizing for Jessica's behavior, it all made sense now. I want this documented, I said firmly. All of it. Already done. The question is whether you want to confront her with this information during the 30-day period, or save it for later. I considered the options. The affair evidence would be devastating to David, but it might also be the wake-up call he needed to see Jessica for who she really was. On the other hand, if I revealed it too early, Jessica might simply cut her losses and leave immediately, taking Sarah's affection with her and leaving my son emotionally destroyed. Save it, I decided. Let's see if she's capable of genuine change first. If she can't manage basic respect and decency during the 30-day period, then we'll know her character definitively. Harrison nodded approvingly. And if she does manage to comply with the behavioral requirements, then she'll have earned the right to know that I know exactly who she is and what she's planning. My phone, which I'd finally turned back on, immediately started buzzing with incoming calls. David's name flashed on the screen for the 15th time that day. Time to let them know the rules of the game, I said, reaching for the phone. But before I could answer, Harrison held up a hand. Margaret, there's one more thing you should know before you talk to them. The seriousness in his voice made me pause. What is it? According to my sources, Jessica's been telling people that you're showing signs of dementia. She's been building a narrative about your mental decline, suggesting that your family might need to consider guardianship options soon. The words hit me like ice water. Guardianship. Jessica had been laying the groundwork to have me declared incompetent, to take control of my finances and my life completely. She's been planning to have me institutionalized, I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. It appears so. The documentation suggests she's been preparing for a long-term campaign to prove you're no longer capable of managing your own affairs. Now I understood why the humiliation at dinner had been so public, so witnessed. Jessica wasn't just trying to exclude me from family life. She was building evidence of my supposed decline, creating a narrative that would support a competency challenge. The phone stopped ringing, and immediately a text message appeared. Mom, please call us back. We can work this out. We're family. I showed the message to Harrison, who shook his head grimly. Family. After everything she's done. Yes, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Family. Which is exactly why Jessica is about to learn that some families have more resources than she ever imagined. I stood up, smoothing my skirt and gathering my purse. The 30-day provision was no longer just about teaching respect. It was about survival. Mine, David's, and any chance Sarah had of growing up with a functioning moral compass. Prepare the documents, I told Harrison. It's time for Jessica to discover that dead weight can be surprisingly powerful when it decides to fight back. I drove to David's house in complete silence, Harrison's documents sealed in an envelope on the passenger seat beside me. 2 weeks had passed since the dinner, 2 weeks of desperate phone calls I hadn't returned, and increasingly frantic text messages I'd ignored. Now it was time to lay out the rules of engagement. The house looked the same from the outside, but I could sense the tension radiating from within before I even rang the doorbell. David answered immediately, as if he'd been watching for my car. Mom, he said, relief flooding his voice. Thank God you're here. We've been trying to reach you for... I know exactly how long you've been trying to reach me, I said, stepping past him into the foyer. Where are Jessica and Sarah? In the living room. Mom, I don't understand what's happening. The bank has frozen most of our accounts. They're demanding immediate meetings, and they keep mentioning your name. David. I turned to face my son, really looking at him for the first time in months. He'd lost weight, there were dark circles under his eyes, and his hands were trembling slightly. Do you remember what your wife said to me at Sarah's birthday dinner? He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. There was some confusion about the soup accident. No, my voice was sharper than I'd intended. There was no confusion. I'm asking if you remember what Jessica said to me after she deliberately poured hot soup on my dress. The silence stretched between us until I heard footsteps from the living room. Jessica appeared in the doorway, and I could see immediately that the past 2 weeks had taken their toll. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail. She wore no makeup, and her designer clothes had been replaced with jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt. Margaret, she said, attempting her old smile but failing to hide the desperation underneath. I'm so glad you're here. There's obviously been some terrible misunderstanding. Sit down, I said quietly, holding up the envelope. Both of you. We need to discuss the terms. Jessica's eyes fixed on the envelope with the unmistakable focus of someone who recognized legal documents. Terms of what? The loan agreement you signed 6 months ago when I bailed you out of debt. David sank heavily onto the couch, his face pale. Mom, you said that was a gift. Family helping family. I said it was assistance. I never said it was without conditions. I remained standing, keeping the positional advantage. Conditions that have been systematically violated. What conditions? Jessica demanded, but her voice lacked its usual commanding tone. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first document. Section 4, subsection C. Loan recipient agrees to maintain respectful family relationships and honor the dignity of all family members throughout the duration of assistance. Jessica's face went white. That's ridiculous. You can't control people's behavior with money. I can control whether I continue to enable behavior that harms me. I set the document on the coffee table between us. Jessica, in front of 8 witnesses, you called me a ghost who shouldn't take up space and described me as dead weight in this family. Would you like me to read the testimony statements I've collected? David was staring at Jessica with dawning horror. You really said that? It was taken out of context, Jessica said quickly. There is no context that makes those words acceptable, I interrupted, and that was merely the culmination of 3 years of systematic disrespect and exclusion. I pulled out a second document, this one much thicker. Would you like me to detail the pattern? The Christmas when you deliberately gave me the wrong time for gift opening? The birthday party where you told me it was canceled while proceeding with the celebration? The family meetings where you've consistently dismissed my input as outdated or irrelevant? Jessica was backing away from the coffee table as if the papers might bite her. You've been spying on us? Documenting conversations? I've been protecting myself from a daughter-in-law who's been systematically working to erase me from my own family's life. I sat down across from them, finally claiming some authority in the space. The question now is whether you're capable of change, or whether this arrangement ends permanently. What do you want? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I pulled out the final document. You have 30 days to demonstrate genuine behavioral change. Public acknowledgement of the disrespect, delivered in front of the same witnesses who saw the humiliation. Full inclusion in family decisions. Evidence that Sarah understands the gravity of her actions and is willing to make amends. And if we comply? Jessica asked through gritted teeth. Then we continue the financial arrangement under the original terms. If you don't, I let the sentence hang in the air. If we don't, what happens? David pressed. The entire assistance package is called in immediately. The credit card debts I paid off, the mortgage assistance, the line of credit, all of it becomes due within 30 days. Jessica shot to her feet. That's blackmail. No, I said calmly. That's accountability. For 3 years, you've treated me like an inconvenience to be managed. You've excluded me, dismissed me, and worked systematically to poison my relationship with my son and granddaughter. Last week, you humiliated me publicly and encouraged Sarah to laugh at my pain. I never encouraged. Where is Sarah? I asked suddenly. I'd like to speak with her. David and Jessica exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know. She's at a friend's house, David said. Since when? Since this morning. Interesting timing. I stood up, gathering the documents. I'll make this simple. You have until tomorrow at 6 p.m. to produce Sarah for a conversation. If she's suddenly unavailable, if she's been coached on what to say, or if she's been sent away to avoid facing consequences, then you'll have your answer about whether change is possible. I headed toward the door, then paused. There's one more thing you should both understand. This isn't just about money anymore. Jessica's mask finally slipped completely. What else could it possibly be about? I turned back to look at them. My weak son and his manipulative wife, sitting in their expensive furniture in a house I was paying for, still believing they could charm or threaten their way out of consequences. It's about whether Sarah grows up thinking it's acceptable to treat elderly family members as disposable. It's about whether she learns that cruelty has no consequences as long as you have something the cruel person wants. It's about breaking a cycle of toxicity before it destroys another generation. David's head was in his hands now. Mom, I never meant for any of this to happen. No, I agreed. You never meant for anything to happen. You've spent 3 years choosing the path of least resistance while your wife systematically dismantled our family. That ends now. I walked to the door, then turned back one final time. By the way, Jessica, my lawyer wanted me to ask you about Portland. The effect was immediate and devastating. Jessica went rigid, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and pure panic in the space of 3 seconds. What about Portland? David asked, looking between us. I'm sure Jessica can explain, I said, pulling the door open. You have 29 days left. I walked to my car without looking back, though I could hear raised voices beginning inside the house. David's confused questions, Jessica's stammered responses, the sound of a marriage beginning to crack under the weight of hidden truths. As I drove away, I found myself thinking about Sarah, 16 years old, laughing at her grandmother's humiliation because she'd been taught that cruelty was acceptable if it was socially sanctioned. Jessica had been grooming her, just like she'd groomed David, teaching her that some people mattered and others didn't. But unlike David, Sarah was still young enough to learn different lessons, still young enough to understand that actions had consequences and that family meant protecting each other, not participating in each other's destruction. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. David's number appeared on the screen, and this time I answered. Mom? His voice was shaky, desperate. What did you mean about Portland? Ask your wife, I said. She'll tell you, eventually. Is there something I should know? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything I knew and everything I was about to destroy. David, the woman you married isn't who you think she is. But you're going to figure that out for yourself over the next few weeks. What does that mean? It means that for the first time in 3 years, you're going to have to choose between enabling Jessica's behavior and protecting what's left of your family. I paused, letting the words sink in. I hope you choose wisely. After I hung up, I sat in my car for a long moment, listening to the silence of my own driveway. 29 days to see if redemption was possible. 29 days to discover whether my son was capable of growth and whether my granddaughter could learn from her mistakes. But I already knew the truth about Jessica. She'd revealed herself completely in those few seconds when I'd mentioned Portland. Whatever facade she was about to construct over the next month would be exactly that, a facade designed to buy time until she could secure her exit strategy. The real question was whether David would see through it in time to save himself, and whether Sarah would choose to become the kind of person who protected the vulnerable instead of participating in their destruction. The next 29 days were going to determine the future of what was left of our family. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on day 28. Sarah's name lit up my phone screen, and I almost didn't answer. For 4 weeks, I'd watched my family implode from a distance, observing their attempts at compliance with my conditions like a scientist studying a failed experiment. The public apology had been delivered, technically. Jessica had gathered the same 8 dinner guests and, with David's trembling hand on her shoulder, had admitted to misunderstanding and poor word choice that had hurt my feelings. Not an acknowledgement of deliberate cruelty, not a recognition of the pattern of abuse, just a carefully crafted non-apology that fulfilled the letter of my requirements while violating their spirit entirely. The family inclusion had been even more performative. I'd been invited to 3 dinners where Jessica had asked my opinion on trivial matters while pointedly ignoring my responses. Sarah had been present for exactly one of these meals, sullen and hostile, clearly there under duress. But this late-night call felt different, desperate in a way that cut through my carefully constructed emotional distance. Grandma? Sarah's voice was thick with tears. Can I come over, please? I sat up in bed, instantly alert. Sarah, what's wrong? Where are you? I'm in my car outside your house. I know it's late, but I didn't know where else to go. Through my bedroom window, I could see headlights in my driveway. Sarah had driven here alone, at midnight, in direct defiance of whatever rules Jessica had undoubtedly established about contact with me. Come to the front door. Sweetheart, I'll meet you there. Sarah looked fragile in the porch light, still wearing the pajama pants and oversized sweatshirt she'd apparently been sleeping in. Her face was blotchy from crying, and she was shivering despite the mild evening. I heard them fighting, she said as soon as I opened the door. Really fighting. Dad was screaming about someone named Rebecca and asking Mom about Portland. And Mom was crying and saying it wasn't what it looked like. My heart sank. David had discovered the affair. Despite my hope that the 30-day trial period might lead to genuine change, Jessica's house of cards was collapsing exactly as I'd predicted. I led Sarah to the kitchen and put the kettle on for tea, giving myself time to choose my words carefully. Whatever I said next would shape how she understood not just this crisis, but the nature of truth and loyalty and family responsibility. "How much did you hear?" I asked gently. "Enough." Sarah slumped in the kitchen chair, looking younger than her 16 years. "Mom's been seeing someone else, hasn't she? Someone from before she met Dad." "I don't know all the details," I said truthfully. "But it sounds like your parents are working through some serious issues." Sarah looked at me with eyes that suddenly seemed much older. "You knew, didn't you? That's why you stopped paying for everything. That's why you made them sign those papers." I poured hot water over tea bags, buying myself another moment. "I knew your mother wasn't who she pretended to be. I didn't know the extent of it until recently. She's been lying to us." Sarah's voice was flat, emotionless. "For how long?" "I think that's a conversation you need to have with your parents." "My parents." She laughed bitterly. "Dad can't even look at her. And Mom?" "God, Grandma. She tried to blame you. She said you'd been manipulating the situation, that you'd hired private investigators to spy on our family, that you were trying to break up their marriage out of spite." The accusation didn't surprise me, but it still stung. "What do you think?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, wrapping her hands around the warm mug I'd placed in front of her. "I think Mom's been teaching me to be cruel, and I think I've been a really good student." The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest in a way that reminded me of the little girl who used to confess her playground mistakes with the same devastating honesty. "Tell me about the dinner," I said quietly. Sarah's face crumpled. "She told me you were getting senile, that you were becoming difficult and that someone needed to make you understand that you couldn't be the center of attention anymore. She said it would be kinder to embarrass you a little bit than to let you keep making a fool of yourself." I felt cold rage building in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "And you believed her?" I wanted to. The words came out in a whisper. It was easier than admitting that I was being mean to someone who'd never been anything but good to me. It was easier than standing up to Mom when she said you were getting in the way of our family's happiness. She looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. "But you weren't getting senile, were you? You were protecting yourself. You knew what Mom was doing long before any of us figured it out." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Sarah, your mother is very good at making people believe her version of reality. She's had years of practice. How long have you known?" "Known what?" "Specifically, that she doesn't love Dad. That she married him for whatever she married him for." The question I'd been dreading, because the honest answer was that I'd suspected from the beginning. But I'd hoped I was wrong. I'd watched Jessica play the role of devoted wife and mother while systematically isolating David from his support system and grooming Sarah to dismiss anyone Jessica deemed inconvenient. "I've known your mother was manipulative for 3 years, I said finally. "I didn't know about the affair until recently, but I knew she didn't respect your father or value our family the way she pretended to." Sarah was crying again, but quietly now. "What's going to happen to us?" "I don't know. That depends on choices your parents make, and choices you make." "What do you mean, choices I make?" I studied my granddaughter's face, seeing David's gentleness mixed with something harder that might have come from Jessica's influence. "You're 16, Sarah. Old enough to understand that actions have consequences. Old enough to choose what kind of person you want to become." "I want to be better than I've been." "Then you will be. But it's going to require admitting some difficult truths about how you've treated people, including me." Sarah nodded, wiping her nose with the tissue I handed her. "At the dinner, when Mom spilled the soup and said those things about you being dead weight, I knew it was wrong when I laughed. I knew it, but I did it anyway because it felt safer to be on her side." "Why did it feel safer?" "Because Mom has this way of making you feel like you're either with her or against her. And when you're against her, she finds ways to make your life miserable." Sarah's voice got smaller. She's been doing it to Dad for years. Little things that made him doubt himself, made him think he was the problem. The picture Sarah was painting matched everything I'd observed, but hearing it confirmed by someone who'd lived inside Jessica's manipulation was heartbreaking. My son had been psychologically abused for years, and I'd been too focused on my own hurt to see the full extent of it. Sarah, I need you to understand something important. What's happening between your parents isn't your fault. The choices your mother made aren't your responsibility, but the choices I made are. Yes, and you can start making different ones now. We sat in silence for a while, drinking tea and listening to the quiet sounds of my house settling around us. Finally, Sarah spoke again. Grandma, the conditions you gave them, the 30 days to prove they could change. Did you really think Mom could do it? The question cut to the heart of everything. Had I offered the 30-day trial because I believed in redemption, or because I wanted to document Jessica's inability to change for my own satisfaction? I hoped she could, I said finally, but I suspected she couldn't. People like your mother don't usually change unless they face consequences that force them to examine their behavior. And people like me? I looked at this young woman who'd driven to my house in the middle of the night, who'd broken the rules her mother had established to seek truth from the grandmother she'd been taught to dismiss, who was sitting in my kitchen acknowledging her mistakes and asking how to do better. People like you change all the time, I said, because you have something your mother doesn't have. What's that? A conscience. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming text, and her face went pale as she read it. It's Dad. He's asking where I am. They probably don't even know I'm gone yet. They've been fighting for hours. What do you want to tell him? The truth. That I came to apologize to my grandmother and to figure out how to be a better person. She looked at me hopefully. Can I stay here tonight? I don't want to go back to that house right now. I thought about David and Jessica, probably still tearing each other apart over the wreckage of their marriage, too consumed with their own drama to notice their daughter had fled the chaos. I thought about the little girl who used to beg to stay for sleepovers, who'd helped me bake cookies and listen to my stories with rapt attention. Of course you can stay, but you need to call your father and let him know you're safe. As Sarah made the call, explaining to David in a voice that was steadier than it had been all evening that she was with me and would be home in the morning, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The 30-day trial period had failed in its stated objective. Jessica hadn't changed, and the marriage was collapsing. But it had succeeded in something more important. It had given Sarah the time and space to see the truth for herself, to recognize manipulation when she encountered it, to choose conscience over convenience. Whatever happened next, I had my granddaughter back. And maybe, if David could find the courage to see Jessica clearly, I might get my son back too. But that was tomorrow's challenge. Tonight, Sarah was safe in my guest room, and I was falling asleep to the sound of someone I loved breathing peacefully under my roof again. After 3 years of systematic exclusion, it felt like coming home. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Sarah's favorite chocolate chip cookies, while she sat at the counter doing homework. Her textbooks spread across the same surface where Jessica had once planned my systematic exclusion from family life. The scene felt both familiar and revolutionary, a return to something we'd lost, but built on a foundation of honesty that hadn't existed before. Grandma, Sarah said, looking up from her calculus problems, do you think Dad's going to be okay? It was a question she'd been asking in various forms since that night she'd fled to my house. David was living in a small apartment across town now, the divorce proceedings moving forward with the grim efficiency that comes when one party has been systematically deceiving the other for years. Jessica had moved back to Portland 3 months ago, her exit as calculated and cold as everything else she'd done. Your father is stronger than he gives himself credit for, I said, sliding a tray of cookies into the oven. It's going to take time for him to trust his own judgment again, but he's getting there. Sarah nodded, though I could see the worry in her eyes. David's recovery from years of psychological manipulation wasn't linear. Some days he was angry, finally seeing the full scope of what Jessica had done to him and to our family. Other days he was depressed, convinced that his inability to see through her lies made him fundamentally flawed. Most days he was simply exhausted from the work of rebuilding his sense of self. But he was doing the work. That was what mattered. The divorce had revealed the full extent of Jessica's financial manipulations. The affair in Seattle had been one of 3 relationships she'd been maintaining. each with wealthy men who believed they were her only confidant. She'd been preparing multiple exit strategies, hedging her bets in case her marriage to David became inconvenient. The Portland investigation had uncovered a pattern going back over a decade. Jessica moved through relationships like a locust through crops, leaving behind men who'd been financially and emotionally decimated by her calculated cruelty. David wasn't her first victim, and if she'd succeeded in having me declared incompetent, he wouldn't have been her last. "I still can't believe I fell for it," Sarah said, echoing thoughts that clearly plagued her father as well. "All those times she told me you were becoming difficult, that you needed to be handled carefully because you were getting confused about things. I actually believed her." "Your mother is exceptionally skilled at manipulation," I said gently. "She had years of practice and she understood exactly which buttons to push. But you saw through it, not immediately, and not completely." I sat down across from Sarah, choosing my words carefully. I knew something was wrong, but I underestimated how far she was willing to go. I thought she was just selfish and inconsiderate. I didn't understand that she was actively working to destroy our family connections. Sarah closed her textbook and looked at me directly. "The night of my birthday dinner, when she spilled the soup and said those things about you being dead weight, that wasn't spontaneous, was it?" I'd been dreading this conversation, but Sarah deserved the truth. Over the past month, she'd been putting pieces together, asking careful questions and drawing uncomfortable conclusions about her mother's behavior. "No," I said finally. "Based on everything that came out during the divorce, that appears to have been planned. She'd been building a case to have me declared incompetent, and public incidents that showed me as confused or difficult would have supported that narrative." Sarah's face went white. "She was trying to have you put away?" "She was trying to gain control of my finances. If she could prove I was mentally declining, she could have herself appointed as my guardian and gained access to everything I've built." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Sarah was processing not just the depth of her mother's betrayal, but her own role in nearly enabling it. If I hadn't had the resources to protect myself, if I hadn't been smart enough to document everything, Jessica might have succeeded. "I would have been an accomplice," Sarah whispered, "by laughing at you, by going along with her narrative about you becoming difficult. I would have been helping her steal your life, but you didn't. When it mattered, when you finally saw what was really happening, you chose differently. Only after it was almost too late." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Sarah, you were a child being manipulated by someone who'd had years to perfect her techniques. Yes, you made mistakes. Yes, you participated in cruelty that you should have recognized as wrong. But you were also brave enough to seek the truth when the lies became too obvious to ignore." The oven timer chimed, and I got up to remove the cookies, using the moment to gather my thoughts. Sarah's guilt was understandable, but I didn't want her to carry the weight of her mother's sins. There was a difference between acknowledging harmful behavior and taking responsibility for evils that had been orchestrated by someone else. "Where is she now?" Sarah asked as I transferred cookies to a cooling rack. "Portland, as far as I know. Harrison's investigators lost track of her about a month ago, but she's not our concern anymore. Do you think she'll try to contact us?" "Probably not. Your mother moves on quickly when a situation becomes inconvenient for her." I paused, considering how much truth Sarah could handle. "She's likely already working on her next target." Sarah absorbed this information with the grim resignation of someone who'd learned too much about human nature too young. "I keep thinking about all the times she told me I was her little accomplice, that we were a team against the world. I thought it meant she loved me." "She did love you in her way. But her way was possessive and conditional. She loved you as long as you served her purposes and reflected well on her image. That's not really love, is it?" "No, sweetheart, it's not." My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. David's name appeared on the screen, and I answered on the second ring. "Hi, Dad," Sarah called out before I could say hello. "Is that my daughter eating all your cookies again?" David's voice carried the first hint of genuine humor I'd heard from him in months. "Only half of them," I assured him. "The other half are for you if you want to come over for dinner." There was a pause, and I could hear David considering the invitation. These family dinners had become a weekly tradition since the divorce, a careful reconstruction of relationships that had been damaged by years of Jessica's interference. David was still fragile, still prone to periods of self-doubt and depression, but he was learning to trust again. "Actually, I have some news," he said, his voice brightening slightly. "I got the promotion, the senior project manager position we talked about." Sarah jumped off her stool and grabbed the phone from my hand. "Dad, that's amazing. When do you start?" As I listened to Sarah congratulate her father, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: uncomplicated family joy. No undercurrents of manipulation, no careful navigation around someone's hidden agenda, just genuine celebration of good news. David arrived for dinner an hour later, carrying flowers and wearing the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since before he'd married Jessica. The promotion was more than just career advancement. It was evidence that he was rebuilding his professional confidence after years of being told he was inadequate. The interview panel said they were impressed by my initiative on the Morrison account, he told us over dinner. "Apparently, I've been doing better work than I thought." "Jessica told you that you weren't good at your job," Sarah said matter-of-factly. It wasn't a question. David nodded, his expression growing more serious. "Among other things, she had a way of making me doubt everything about myself, my work, my parenting, my judgment. I started believing I was incompetent. But you weren't," I said firmly. "You were being systematically undermined by someone who benefited from your lack of confidence. I know that now. Intellectually, anyway. The emotional knowledge is taking longer to sink in." After dinner, Sarah excused herself to call a friend, leaving David and me alone at the kitchen table with our coffee. These one-on-one conversations had become precious to me. Opportunities to rebuild the relationship Jessica had worked so hard to poison. "Mom," David said, stirring sugar into his cup, "I owe you an apology. Not just for the dinner incident, but for years of letting Jessica treat you badly. I knew what she was doing, and I chose not to see it because it was easier than confronting her. You were in an abusive relationship, David. People in those situations often can't see clearly because the abuse is designed to distort their perception. But you're my mother. I should have protected you." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw someone who was finally learning to forgive himself for being human. "You were protecting yourself the only way you knew how. Jessica was very good at making people feel like they had to choose between her happiness and everyone else's well-being." "How did you know? How did you see through her when I couldn't?" It was a fair question, one I'd been thinking about for months. Distance, maybe, and experience. I'd seen manipulative people before, though never someone quite as skilled as Jessica. But mostly, I think it was because I wasn't emotionally dependent on her approval. David was quiet for a moment, processing this. "The loan conditions you imposed, the 30-day trial period, did you really think we could change? Or were you just documenting our failure?" The question cut to the heart of my own motivations, forcing me to examine whether my actions had been about justice or revenge. I hoped you could change. I hoped that consequences might shock Jessica into genuine self-reflection. But I was also protecting myself and gathering evidence in case legal action became necessary. And Sarah? Were you testing her too? I thought about my granddaughter, who'd driven to my house in the middle of the night seeking truth instead of comfort, who'd chosen honesty over loyalty to her mother's version of reality. Sarah proved herself when it mattered most. She could have stayed silent, could have continued going along with Jessica's narrative to avoid conflict. Instead, she chose to seek the truth, even when it was painful. As if summoned by our conversation, Sarah reappeared in the kitchen doorway. "Are you guys talking about me?" "We're talking about how proud we are of you," David said, and I could hear the genuine emotion in his voice. Sarah joined us at the table, and for a moment we sat in comfortable silence. 3 generations of a family that had been broken and was slowly healing. The kitchen around us held memories of Jessica's manipulation, but it also held newer memories of honest conversations and rebuilding trust. "What happens now?" Sarah asked eventually. "Now we keep doing the work," I said. "We keep choosing honesty over convenience, and we keep protecting each other instead of enabling harmful behavior. And we remember that family isn't about blood relations or legal obligations," David added. "It's about people who choose to love and support each other, even when it's difficult. As my son and granddaughter gathered their things to leave, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the woman I'd become through this ordeal. 6 months ago, I'd been someone who accommodated cruelty to keep peace, who'd allowed myself to be diminished rather than risk conflict. The woman saying goodbye to her family tonight was someone who understood her own worth and was willing to fight for it. Someone who'd learned that real love sometimes required difficult boundaries, and that protecting yourself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Jessica had tried to erase me from my own family's story. Instead, she'd forced me to reclaim my place in it on my own terms. Standing in my doorway, watching David and Sarah drive away together to their new life built on honesty instead of manipulation, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't defeating your enemies. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let them destroy what matters most. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's discovering that you're stronger than you ever imagined you could be.